Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name is Elizabeth Braw, and until last week, I led the Modern Deterrence Project at RUSI, and this is in fact the final event of the Modern Deterrence Project. So I'm very pleased that we're addressing an emerging area of concern, and which is environmental disasters. And I'm very happy to do that in cooperation with Clifford Chance, who have been fantastic partners of the Modern Deterrence Project for a long time, or since its inception. And I'm also grateful to the other organizations that have supported Modern Deterrence, and those are Willis Towers Watson, Fraser Nash Consultancy, the Ministry of Defense of Latvia, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Zurich Insurance, and I'm missing somebody, NATO, and the Ministry of Defense of Lithuania. So a big thank you to all of you, because without support from organizations such as these, there would be no think tank activity. But today I'm, as I said, incredibly excited, or rather troubled by this subject, because it is a subject of growing concern, and we're having this event as floodings are causing chaos in France and Italy, for example. And this year, this terrible year started with wildfires in Australia, devastating wildfires, the wildfires raging in California. And the question is, how do we prepare for such contingencies? Because they will continue to occur and wreak havoc on our societies. And so I'm very pleased to be joined by Matt Foote from Willis Towers Watson and Caroline Dawson from Clifford Chance, both with expertise, but in different areas. And they will, I think, in fact, I know they will illuminate the problem for each from their different perspective. And the way we'll do it, again, under Chatham House rules, as always, is as an interview, a conversation. And the reason we have the event set up in this way is that you all can then come in with comments. I'm not a fan of having to type into a Q&A bar, and so you won't have to do that either. You'll be able to speak and be heard and seen. First, I will have a conversation with Matt and Caroline, and feel free to indicate in the chat function to me that you'd like to come in after that. So if I can start with you, Matt, to what extent can natural disasters be predicted? And if you can also talk about maybe the difference between, to which extent can environmental disasters be predicted? And if you can also talk about the difference between natural disasters and man-made environmental disasters.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And just to say, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on this event. Thank you for inviting me on. Yeah, from my perspective, my background, I'm a catastrophe analyst by training, a modeler for the reinsurance markets for many years. And so from my perspective, it's probably easier to talk about environmental disasters, natural disasters being forecasted rather than predicted. And it might seem a bit academic to most people, but it does influence the way then that you can go about assessing and managing what I would consider to be extreme or tail risk in most cases. So this is large scale catastrophic natural disasters and hazards. And so I'd say, first of all, that I think if you were to say what's the difference, well, prediction to me actually means that there's an element of precision in your future forecasting of an event. So you'd actually be able to say, for instance, an earthquake is going to happen at 7:42 in the morning of a certain magnitude. And obviously that's not possible given current levels of science, and probably never. So, and it's the same for other types of natural hazards and environmental disasters as well. That actually what we do end up doing isn't predicting, but actually building in a level of uncertainty and chance. And so what we try and do is build a view of the risk of certain natural hazards occurring, where uncertainty is part of that process, and that you come up with a chance. So what's the chance, for instance, of a magnitude 8 earthquake in California occurring in the next 30 years. What's the percentage probability of that? That's the way that, in my career, that's been the way that we've assessed risk. It's to give people the ability to try and understand what the possible severity and frequency of events might be to those types of events. And I think, as you said, Elizabeth, actually, I think it's true in some ways to environmental or industrial disasters as well. So man-made type events where, again, you can maybe have a view of that you could predict, yes, there will be another explosion like Beirut explosion somewhere in the world at some point in time in the future. But of course, being able to say when and where and in what context, or the severity, the particular severity or impacts of that, is impossible. So what in the insurance and reinsurance markets is done in those types of events is actually to look at historical records, to the observations of past events, and try then to use those historical records to build a forecast. How likely is it that you will have an event in a certain type, in a certain area, at a certain time? And so that really is the way that we try and assess the potential, not by predicting, but by forecasting both the possible frequency, how often, how likely is it in a given period of time, but also the impact severity, so how bad could it be? And those two things are actually both difficult to do without resorting to both, as I said, historical data, but very importantly, and particularly around natural hazards, science and analytics. And so we would tend to look to modelling of natural hazards, whether that's windstorms or floods or earthquakes, as a key part of that process. And I think by building what we would call catastrophe models in my line of business, which is effectively the combination of best available scientific views about how events occur, their physical causes, the processes that operate them, where and how large they might be, and then importantly, how often they occur, combining that with statistical modelling and the ability then to develop that frequency and severity view of possible future risks, is the way that we deal with that uncertainty. The important thing, of course, is that those models are inherently uncertain. So we know that it's impossible to be able to predict what's going to happen in reality. What we provide in those models is our best estimate of future potential risks in particular context that then can be used to inform more effective decisions and strategies around how to deal with those types of events, whether they're natural disasters or, as you said, it could be also man-made or other. I think because models provide a level of usability and they become increasingly sophisticated with better science and better data, they become quite, I'd say, easy to incorporate into decisions. And the important thing then is not to overestimate the ability of those models to be predictive in that sense. And so it goes back to that difference between prediction and forecasting. And certainly from my experience in my area of business, informed decisions would often then take account of the understanding of what the major weaknesses were in the models that you've used. You've got to understand, obviously, how those models have been produced, the sorts of data that's been put into them. The reason why we've got to do that, obviously, is that historical records, by and large, are too short and not complete enough to give us a sense of all possible future outcomes. And so we do rely on the models. But that's the same in not only in reinsurance, obviously in insurance, but more broader on disaster risk management. I used to work for the World Bank, and one of the areas that I was involved in was in the development of hazard modelling and risk modelling to support sovereign level disaster risk plans. Same context, the same process. Being able to provide models that help inform decisions without making too much of a precision to those that's not appropriate to the accuracy of the model, and providing people with the ability to judge and validate those models in the most appropriate way.
So we are in a situation where there are not enough cases under but you can't use historical data to judge or to predict what's going to happen, because climate change is changing the situation so much. So basically that makes forecasting even more complicated, that's what I take away from your answer. So what does climate change mean? Is it even possible to forecast in any meaningful sense what might happen if the conditions are changing so much that we can't use historical data? And that's a question again for you, Matt.
Sure. I mean, obviously climate change clearly adds another very large level of complexity when you're trying to develop models of forecasting future hazard impacts. That's a given, because obviously the future isn't necessarily going to follow what's happened in the past. There is no, one of the major issues with climate change is what I call non-stationarity. Basically, the future is not necessarily predicated by what we've seen in the previous circumstances. Patterns of risk are changing. And of course, one of the major issues now is obviously that while science clearly says we can expect changes based on greenhouse gas emissions that are being measured, obviously, clearly the mean global temperature is measurable. The actual impacts at the localized level of natural catastrophes are very hard to take account of. They're so complex, it's the chaotic nature of them. You'd need an awful lot of different data. There are ways and means of doing it, but there are approximations. And why that's important, I think one of the main things that's having an impact for us at the moment in our business is that obviously if you look at organisations or governments that are making decisions on long-term infrastructure planning, for instance, one area that I have worked on a lot is infrastructure risk. Decisions that are being made now, both in terms of what sorts of critical infrastructure is being put in place in countries and by organisations, and equally then what sorts of assets are being invested in, whether that's because of the need to move away from certain types of infrastructure, for instance, fossil generated power into renewable energy, or indeed building new power generation or water supply services around countries. Those decisions now being made have long-term implications. And so you have to take account not only of current climate situations and conditions and hazard, catastrophe modelling as I traditionally use it, but then best estimates of what that's going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years over the life cycle of infrastructure assets. So these are very, very pertinent, very immediate questions for a lot of organisations now thinking about their strategies for infrastructure and how that infrastructure is put in place. As I said, also at sovereign level. So this is a sovereign level issue as well. And so it cuts across many, many areas, and you need the analytics to give yourself a chance actually of being able to assess that future risk. The problem, of course, is that even compared to the modelling that I've had access to over the years on current climatic hydrometeorological perils, for instance, putting in climate conditioning into those is even more fraught with difficulty. It's an evolving science. That means that the view of the different hazards and the different frequencies and severity potentials will change, and they are quite regularly. With IPCC changes in the modelling, we're about to have a complete new set of IPCC-based climate model outputs coming out, which will inform new modelling views. They will change the view of risk. And so it's very difficult to take what we know to be clear global average shifts in climate and greenhouse gases into effective and confident climatic hazard data and modelling. And that's only looking just at the hazard. I mean, the other parts of the risk triangle, as I call it, the exposure, the assets, the people, the things that are in harm's way, that are exposed to those hazards will change as well, as will the vulnerabilities, the things that actually change the way that they will respond to those types of events. So every part of that triangle is moving. All parts of the jigsaw puzzle are moving at the same time. And so it's a very, very difficult situation for an analyst, but it also keeps us very busy, and certainly the type of work that's being done on infrastructure, as an example, as I said, is now starting to develop the tool sets that will allow investment companies, asset owners and others to make informed decisions, at least in a way that's fit to allow them to make strategic decisions now going into the future.
Thank you, Matt. I'm glad you brought in the business angle, because this is really an issue that's not just of concern, or shouldn't be of concern just to those of us who are concerned about the environment, but it is a matter of business continuity, and in fact, in the wider sense of national security. And at the very least, it poses a lot of difficult questions for or tasks for analysts, as you said, Matt, but also for business leaders. And so I wanted to bring you in, Caroline, to ask you about decision making and how all of this impacts and affects decision making, and what can you tell us about that, and also the sort of risks that these changes bring with them, and also maybe the liability as the companies, business leaders have to consider. So if you can come in on that. There is somebody who's unmuted, and there's a lot of static, a bit of static on the line. So if you can be so kind and check whether you are muted or unmuted, and then we'll be able to hear Caroline loud and clear.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. So yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of my background, I'm a banking lawyer. I specialise in financial services regulation. So I suppose, you know, moving away from Matt's side area of expertise, which is more around analysing these potential risks and working out the likelihood of particular frequency, severity. I think my aspect on this is much more around how people deal with those risks. So thinking about business continuity arrangements that you might put into place, thinking about how you might deal with this contractually, and then also thinking about once these incidents have actually arisen, what steps you might need to take to protect yourself. I suppose starting with the financial services industry, so there is a process for periodic stress testing of financial services firms, so for banks and investment firms. And really, I suppose in terms of how they manage the uncertainties that Matt outlined at the beginning, it's really very much about building a solid set of assumptions. So identifying a series of events that could potentially impact your business, and then assuming a range of scenarios over a short, medium, and long term, and then assessing the impact of those scenarios on your business. So while you aren't necessarily preparing for a specific event, you should in theory be prepared for any type of event which is likely to impact your business. I think obviously at the moment we're living through one of those events, and I think the current COVID related disruption has thrown up a whole range of issues which weren't necessarily covered by people's existing business continuity planning. So particularly looking at things like location and usefulness of backup sites. And I think a lot of people's business continuity planning was very much based on the assumption that you'd have a specific event. Maybe you'd have a terrorist attack, maybe you'd have a flood, you'd have some kind of extreme weather event, which meant that you couldn't access your primary business location. So therefore you need an alternate business location. And essentially the business continuity plan is premised on you moving all of your business from your first location out to the alternate location. And clearly that isn't how the business continuity scenarios have played out in the context of the pandemic.
If I can interrupt you, Caroline, or the plan in many cases was for sort of one day after the office due to a terrorist incident, and then we don't return.
No, completely. Yeah, I mean that was another point I was going to touch on in a minute. Is exactly that, about the duration of the event. So if people are thinking about extreme weather events, they're thinking about terrorist attacks. Maybe it is only one day out of the office, maybe it's a week out, maybe it's a month out. But what we've seen with this particular event isn't moving from one location to another, it's everyone scattered to the four winds. So then you need to think about things like your office culture, how you're going to onboard new joiners, how you're going to exercise proper oversight, proper supervision with all of your staff working remotely. And then obviously there's the point that you touched on just now, Elizabeth, so the duration of the event. Which I think really means not just that you need to be thinking about long-term backup plans, but also you need to start thinking about other issues that aren't necessarily part of your immediate business continuity plan. So how you ensure your consistent firm culture on a long-term basis, how you ensure that all of your staff feel part of a team, how you ensure that people's mental health needs are appropriately supported, how you, how you support your staff as a general point. And I think all of this really feeds back into whether people need to start thinking about different types of events when they're putting together their business continuity plan. So obviously, we've talked about some of the main scenarios that people think about. So they think about terrorist attacks, they think about floods, weather events. They might also think about things like cybersecurity breaches. I suppose some larger firms might subscribe to update services, which notify their staff of local events in areas that they're travelling to. They might also have in place arrangements to support employees if they're trapped in areas which are currently undergoing disruptive events. But maybe people not need to start thinking about longer term business continuity planning. They need to start thinking about multi-site solutions. And then I think another really key point is the potential for events which impact technology. So remote access, technology, all of this has been so crucial to companies' resilience in response to the coronavirus disruption. But then let's say if we, people have been talking about the possibility of a massive solar flare recently. So if you have a massive solar flare, there's the potential for disruption to satellites, the potential for disruption of the power grid. So if you build that on top of the coronavirus, again, like people maybe need to start thinking about multiple events together, but also particularly if you have a business continuity plan that's very dependent on technological solutions, what might happen if those solutions themselves are then disrupted?
Exactly. We remote working or working from home is fine if we're all set up for that to be done efficiently and securely. And so, as you mentioned, what happens if there's a solar flare, and also what happens if infrastructure too is disrupted by the extreme weather events. So, for example, what we've seen in California is that not just telephone lines, but transformer stations. I think that's what they're called. Matt, feel free to correct me. Anyway, the sort of hubs for the telephone lines, they too have been destroyed by the fires. And then, of course, that's much harder to repair. So a question for both of you before we start the discussion with everybody. The bottom line here is that if environmental disasters, natural disasters, and man-made disasters aren't accurately, or at least somewhat accurately forecasted, we as individuals and companies stand to lose a lot of, both working days and money. So what we have discussed so far, what does that mean for the bottom line of businesses in particular, and for us as consumers? Is there anything we can do, or are we stuck now with somewhat a bit of guesswork, really, when it comes to forecasting natural environmental disasters, simply because we don't have enough data? So I guess if we start with you, Matt, and then you, Caroline.
I think it's a good question. I think obviously, while I think there are challenges, and obviously Caroline's made an amazing important point here, which I think, in terms of, and it just struck me actually that one of the major issues is now with COVID, it's almost an existential extra risk that, frankly, in the insurance markets, pandemic has been well researched, well modelled, and has been factored into the financial capital models, internal models of insurance companies for a number of years. Also, going on to that point, Caroline, about scenarios. I mean, scenarios for solar storm and for other factors have all been part of the Lloyd's market, particularly for many years. They're a core part of every insurance syndicate's managing agent's risk management process. And they're used all the way up into board decisions. The problem has been, I think, that nobody really considered the wider implications and impacts of what would be a trigger having much wider impacts on other parts of a systemic risk profile. So, for instance, COVID-19 having the impact it's had on liability insurance, for instance, rather than just life insurance, where it was a mortality issue, which is what was being modelled. Suddenly, it's now actually more of an issue probably for insurance companies on their standard property business interruption books, whereas they wouldn't maybe factored it in as much as a risk before in their models. And so it's really just trying to think of all the possible contributions of the risk scenarios that you can consider, and whether you factored in and captured the main parts in the analytics and modelling that you use to make those decisions. The thing that struck me when I was at the World Bank was one of the issues, obviously, if you have something like COVID-19, which has both a fiscal and a societal impact at country level, for instance, and it reduces the ability of a country to be able to respond financially to other shocks. Going back to Caroline's point, if you have more than one event in a year, which is possible, obviously, you may have a vastly reduced fiscal capacity or even a health capacity for an event from COVID that then reduces your ability to be resilient, say, for instance, to an earthquake or a tropical cyclone. And we've seen examples of both of those in the last year. Obviously, in Croatia, there was an earthquake after the pandemic had struck, and there was a lockdown, which hampered the relief efforts at the emergency response efforts. And then also in the Pacific, in Vanuatu, tropical cyclone Harold again hit while there was a lockdown situation and social distancing in that part of the world as well. And we're seeing it in the US as well through the hurricane season. So these things add complication, they accentuate potential impacts and damage or loss to events that otherwise may well have been more withstandable and they would have more resilience. So it's trying to then factor these things into an increasingly complex and uncertain set of conditions. And scenarios actually are one major way of doing it. And I'd say, so there are ways of being able to deal with it from modelling and a risk assessment perspective. And then if you look at just physical aspects, if you look at Bangladesh as a country, for instance, they've been able to reduce, at least in the last few tropical cyclones and floods, the number of deaths and serious injuries by planning ahead, putting in place flood refuges as they've learned. So there are things that can be done. You can't model or risk manage your way out of everything. Obviously, there's always going to be a level of residual risk that you're going to have to face, but there are mechanisms to try and mitigate it, both physical, policy and financial. And I think it's just finding the right strategy informed by the best available information to do that.
Thank you. Over to you, Caroline.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is a really important point about, you know, how well modelled a lot of these events have been. And I think then if you look at how that plays out into, as Matt said, you know, the capital reserves that are held by the insurers, how they conduct their business vis-a-vis their customers, you can see all of that play out. I think when it actually comes to individual businesses and their own business continuity planning for how this plays out for them physically on the spot, on the ground, you know, while people are aware that these events are out there, I think a lot of people's business continuity plans didn't necessarily factor these sorts of scenarios in. And I think then turning to look at potential impacts for individuals and maybe for some of the smaller businesses, I mean, I think one significant area has to be the impact for people's pensions and for personal investments. So, you know, particularly a significant amount of people's pension funds and their private investments has historically been in companies that could be exposed to these types of events. So I guess going back a little bit now, but if you look at the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010, so that sparked a focus on the amount of UK pensions invested in BP shares, because I think one of the UK authorities estimated that it was something like 1.5% of BP shares were owned by UK pension funds. And then that's just the shares themselves. Then you've got to factor in the income from dividends. And I think BP itself estimated that it accounted for, I think, 8% of UK pension fund income. So, you know, clearly that's a massive exposure concentrated in one area. And then obviously that isn't just necessarily as a result of direct investments in those shares. You've got pension funds and retail clients who could be invested in tracker funds. There are all sorts of other ways in which you can get indirect exposures to those investments. I suppose looking at another area, so again, thinking about individuals, so looking at the impact on housing stock of some of these significant events, and just looking at the UK. So I think the Environment Agency estimates that 1 out of 10 of all new homes that have been built in the UK since 2013 have been built on areas of floodplain which are exposed to the highest risk of flooding. So essentially, there's a 1% risk of flooding, 1% or more risk of flooding in that area every year. And so then I suppose turning to the availability and the extent of insurance cover, obviously this is something that the insurers are very much on top of, but then are the consumers on top of the types of insurance that could be available to them? And I think a classic example that we saw from this year, seeing all these sporting events being cancelled. Wimbledon was cancelled, and as it turns out, the All England Lawn Tennis Club has been taking out pandemic insurance every year since 2003, because they saw what happened with SARS and they thought, okay, this has got to be something that's worthwhile for us to do. So they were covered for cancellation, but actually a lot of those annual events weren't necessarily covered. And then also looking at the retail end of the market, obviously in the last couple of weeks, we've had the High Court judgment for the test case that the FCA brought against a number of insurers, just looking at the terms of their business interruption insurance, because a lot of people were finding they'd taken out business interruption insurance, but then the way that that insurance was worded meant that they couldn't necessarily rely on it to claim in the context of a pandemic or in the context of the government saying, regardless of whether or not you can physically go into your office, we're telling you, you need to stay at home. And similarly, you see that play out with, with home insurance. So UK homeowners struggling to get home insurance that covers flood risk, or American homeowners struggling to get home insurance which covers them for fire risk. So yeah, I think a lot of potentially quite severe impacts, certainly to individuals.
Exactly, and if we don't worry about environmental disasters for any other reason, you're right, we should worry about it because it may affect our pensions. And that's a good point about the BP oil spill. I certainly wasn't aware of that particular aspect of it. So yet another reason to be concerned about this, and not just to be concerned about it, but to consider it. So there are a number of people who have messaged me. So we'll start with Roland Rogers, and if you can all introduce yourselves. So yes, you turned your camera on, and obviously feel free to unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. My name's Roland Rogers. I'm a Emeritus Fellow at the National Oceanographic Centre. I'm a retired meteorological and oceanographic forecaster in the Navy. I study on this aspect of this area of interest. I just want to go back to an earlier part of what Matt was talking about in terms of modelling and observations. My particular area is the oceans. And though we have quite well developed ocean structure forecast models, one of the big weaknesses is observations. So for example, the tsunami is not something you can use a model to predict in advance. You use models to predict the effect once it's been identified, but you're then really to determine what's happening, you're reliant on an observation using tidal gauges. And it's interesting that the sort of observations of the environment, the land-based and the air are the best supported in terms of finance and coverage. The ocean remains one of the areas which is least best supported. And part of that problem is the fact that observations currently in the ocean are predominantly done by marine scientists, and therefore a lot of the funding for the observations we get are through that avenue. So they're not sustained. So at the moment within the G7, the subject of sustained observations in the oceans is one being discussed. And underlying that is what sort of finance model should we be looking at to get an international sustained observation scheme, which would help with the environmental disasters arising from the oceans. So I just want to make a case for observations. As a naval forecaster, my job was to forecast events in the ocean. And I used to rely on both real-time observations, historical data and model data. So models have a role to play. They have their limitations, as we've heard from Matt, but an important part of what we want to do to mitigate against environmental disasters is to maintain sustained observations. Thank you.
This is why it's so rewarding to run events here at RUSI, because you get people with expertise that you didn't think even existed. I mean, I knew the Navy, the Royal Navy and other navies use forecasting, but I didn't think of it in this context. But here you are, Matt, a very good question, I think, that from Roland, or actually comments, if you'd like to follow up.
First of all, I thoroughly agree, Roland, and I think I'd certainly be the first to support any investment in better observational data of oceanic processes, not only from a direct physical aspect, but obviously as a driver of the climatic changes that we're seeing anyway. And so better understanding across the board. I mean, I'm a coastal scientist myself, so I've got an interest in wave energy, and one of the projects actually that we're working on is actually looking at mangrove reef insurance protection, because obviously mangroves are a key, effectively a natural physical barrier in many parts of the world, particularly Mesoamerica, to changing wave and surge climates. And so, you know, understanding better both the physical processes that are operating in oceans, as well as the drivers that may change that over time, it's an obvious area that needs to be developed. In fact, I work very closely, probably one of your colleagues, Kevin, in the NOC up in Proudman, and you know, he's a storm surge specialist, and when we talk, he's always explaining how, again, exactly what you said around the need for better observational data of the oceans. It's a critical part. I mean, my background is actually as a remote sensor. I'm an Earth observation person by training, and so I naturally do feel that satellite-based and other remotely sensed data is a key part of the growing toolkit of data sets that we can use, but it is not a panacea. And I thoroughly agree with you that we need better in situ observed data that can help calibrate models better. I mean, that's the whole point. To add more confidence to modeling, you need better calibration data. And I think that's where I would thoroughly agree, as I said, that you need to invest in situ and high resolution data as much as you can.
I'm keen to bring in Howard. Roland, did you have anything you wanted to say there?
Yeah, just to reply, it's Professor Kevin you're thinking of, Matt. And I think the problem that the G7 countries are finding at the moment is, how do you get that funding in? Where does it come from? Because governments say, well, we're already investing in ocean observation, so it's where the uplift is required. Do we go to industry or to the insurance companies and ask, do you want to contribute to this? So, but thank you very much for your answer.
No, thank you.
I'm keen to bring in Howard Jones. So Howard, if you can make yourself known. And in the meantime, I'll bring in Gareth. Gareth, if you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, my name is Gareth Jones. I'm a resilience guy. I've been doing this sort of work for about 40 years in CNI. And obviously I'm interested in this topic because I think we've got a severe problem actually in this whole sort of topic space. And I've been doing some work over the pandemic. And in fact, I did work back in H1N1 for the NHS and for government and so on. So I've been involved in CNI. Now, I don't know where the audience is based, but I'm talking pretty much from a very UK-centric perspective, although I think some of the things I'm going to say are relevant to a lot of other developed nations. I've been working with a fledgling NGO, a really crazy NGO in some ways, because it's about existential risk, and particularly food sources in existential risk. And it's an NGO called ALLFED, ALLFED. And for pretty much all of my career, the last nearly 40 years, I've been dealing with, apart from some war fighting, I've been dealing with nuclear things. I've been dealing with business continuity in the last 20 years, resilience, crisis management, these sort of things in all sorts of organizations. And I've always been dealing with things at the left-hand end of the spectrum, the normal interruptions, power, technology not working, all of the things we talk about business continuity in the financial sector. The NGO I've been working with is totally at the opposite end of existential risks and the big environmental things, things that will block sunlight, things that will stop, water supplies and so on. And I think my point I'd like to make about this predicting environmental disasters is that actually we've got all the prediction we need pretty much. We know roughly what can hit us. And what I think our biggest problem is that we have massive expertise in pretty much all fields, whether it's oceanography or whatever it might be. Nobody's fighting for funding. But actually, if you look at the observations coming out of the pandemic, what we've seen is that nations that have invested in CNI, nations that have actually done some decent planning have probably come off better, or some have come off better by luck. But actually, if you looked at the interconnectedness that we have now, what we're seeing is that the V20, the 48 countries in the bottom list, are getting very little help. There's going to be, out of this pandemic, the economic effects. Aid is going to be cut. There's going to be another 60 million people going into food poverty. 60 million, which is in short term, is kind of pretty amazing, really. But the problem that we've got is not about the decision make. It's not about the models, the predictability of these events. We know most of the things that could hit us. Actually, the biggest problem we've got is that governments will not invest in preparedness, and the UK not investing in preparedness for the pandemic, for instance, is an example. So we need to find a new model to have scenario planning, to bring realism into our planning. We need, the UK, for instance, needs to have a national scenario planning centre that can back up decision making, because there isn't really anything that does it. Or we need to find a way as a community, because I'm presuming most people on this call are interested in this topic, of natural disasters. We know, for instance, changing temperatures in Russia will impact grain production. We saw it a while ago where we had a few degrees raise in temperature, we had a grain problem. So the interconnectedness we've got is complexity. And we're not going to solve these complex problems and get the right decisions from the decision makers unless we can prove that. And the modeling is part of it, but actually it's bringing it home in reality. If you went to Chile and you looked at the approach Chile took after their first big earthquakes, they invested in measures and they thought about impact on GDP. You don't even hear GDP or competitiveness mentioned in most resilience disciplines. So I think what I'm trying to say is that predicting it, I don't think, yes, we can predict things better and we can look for sensors, we can get better situation awareness, we can do a lot of things. But actually having the preparedness and the capabilities in place, our biggest problem is actually getting our decision makers to actually decide that this is something worth investing in. Because GDP damage out of the pandemic could have been less if we were better prepared. But we've been at this a long time and we didn't manage to do it very well. So I guess this audience, what I'm trying to say is, I just don't think we're on it. As a community, we've got to find a better way. Predicting it is one thing, but it's the decision makers that actually is the problem. And we need to have scenario planning, we need to have new tools, and we need to have a new approach. So I think a lot of it is bust. And if you think it's bad in the developed nation, you want to start looking at some of the V20. My God, well, there's 48 countries. It is extremely bad. So I just want to...
On that not very uplifting note, Gareth, I'll let Matt and Caroline come in. And I believe there is somebody on the call from the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. You may all know that in some countries there is more preparedness and resilience training than there is in the UK. So I'm not exactly sure, I can't remember the name of the person from the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, but if you're on the call, please feel free to identify yourself so we can hear about what that agency does. But I'll let maybe Caroline, if you'd like to go first on the need for more preparedness and if I may add, not just in the government, but across the business community.
Yes, and I mean, I would completely agree with all of that. And I'm not sure that it's a lack of awareness that we need more preparedness. I think to some extent it's that people have done a cost benefit analysis, and you know, it's like all of the people with massive sporting events this year who didn't take out their pandemic insurance. They'd seen SARS, they'd seen MERS, they'd seen everything else, they'd seen, you know, the possible risk of Ebola becoming a pandemic, and decided that actually it wasn't worth. I think the Lawn Tennis Association paid something like £1.5 million a year since 2003. So I suspect it's a very similar thing with the government, at least in the UK. You know, if you look at probably the NHS as one of the biggest socialised disaster management arrangements that we have, currently being massively undermined, you know, and then it builds up from there. So, you know, while it would be amazing if we could have some kind of centralised disaster management process, I suspect that there is a slightly more monetary basis for why we haven't seen something so far.
Thank you, Caroline. Matt, did you want to come in? And for everybody, Roland has kindly put a couple of websites here in the chat, so feel free to consult the chat while also giving Matt for your full attention.
I just want to say, Gareth, I fully agree. I think from my experience at the World Bank working at sovereign level, my main area of work was in Southeast Asia, around the Ring of Fire, effectively. So countries where natural disasters are a way of life daily. You know, the way that governments particularly have to make obviously hard decisions around what to spend money on, particularly middle income or low income countries, obviously, where resources are clearly going to be straitened anyway. There's a need, I think it's the way the bank was doing it, the World Bank was doing it, was effectively to build longer term development plans that included both policy reform where it was needed at government level, but also to make sure that the on the ground community level resilience, response and planning, the small stuff that can add up immensely to overall resilience, were also put in place. But you're right, you need a strategy. That strategy has to be one that can be owned, I suppose, in a way, you know, by those governments, by those communities, by those entities that are effectively responsible for delivering that resilience. And like anything, if you have multiple actors all involved in that, there are going to be different objectives. For instance, in public assets, you'll have often in a government 30 or 40 different asset owning entities, state entities. They'll all have their own priorities around which assets are most important to protect, for instance, against natural hazards. So you've got to find a way to bring that group to a consensus when you know that you're not going to be able to protect everything, probably with the budgets that are available. You have to make strategic decisions. And that means you need a consensus. And I fully agree that what you need there isn't just modelling. You need an approach that brings people to a collective view of what's the most effective strategic approach. And that's a stakeholder view, basically built around scenarios. You need to have those scenarios to show people the reason. It goes back to Caroline's point before about cost benefit. You've got to be able to show that. That's where the modelling should be employed. It is not a panacea. It's only a component of a bigger risk management and strategic approach that needs to bring everybody's views in and get a collective sense of direction. But it's not easy, particularly when you've got such uncertainties, and the data, particularly that you've got to do it, is often not very good. So you're always going to struggle being able to convince, as you said, Gareth, the right people to make the right decisions. But it's something that people, you know, work on. That's pretty much what the World Bank's GFER team, if you come across them, do. That's what they do. But I agree entirely.
I can just make a point. It seems to me that in order for us to mitigate the results of environmental disasters, well, we obviously need more resilience, and a number of countries are better prepared in the UK because, for example, they have national contingencies agencies. But we also need to maybe change our behavior, and that's both companies and individuals, that we, for example, don't live in areas that are high risk. And that means, for example, large parts of Florida should maybe not be inhabited. So that seems very extreme. But Matt and Caroline, do you think that, well, both from a disaster mitigation point of view and from a legal point of view, is such a strategy desirable?
I mean, I think people have looked at this maybe on a smaller scale in the past, so particularly in the context of areas which are prone to volcanic eruptions. You know, what you see is that people had their homes in the potential path of a volcanic eruption, knowing that in the last 30 years there's been a volcanic eruption which wiped out their homes and everyone around them. The same thing happens to them, and then they come back and build on the same spot. And partly that's you know, a matter of, you know, geological soil is particularly fertile, it's a good place to be, maybe people don't have anywhere else to go. I think if you're just relying on people to move themselves out of the way of disaster, I think just human nature and history has shown us that that doesn't happen. So then you're looking at some kind of government-based relocation strategy, and then, you know, where are you looking at moving people to? And I think, you know, you just need to look at the sort of carving up of Europe after the First World War. You know, there are endless precedents for people making disastrous decisions about relocation of large numbers of people. So in theory, it's a great idea.
Sure, it's 8146106.
Yeah, in reality, I suspect you run into human nature and also potentially human rights problems.
Yes. Oh, I do.
Lucy,
I know.
we can't
I'm
hear
trying to
you.
find it. Hang on.
Lucy, we can hear you. If you can mute yourself. And Matt, over to you. And we'd like.
Yeah, I think, again, from my experience with the World Bank on small island states, particularly, small island states, you have nowhere else to go in most cases, in the Pacific particularly. You know, countries, Marshall Islands, for instance, I think the highest point in the Marshall Islands is about 3 meters, 4 meters high off sea level. You know, you're not talking about changes in extreme storms causing problems there. It's just changes in sea level and large waves, you know, that they're going to have big impacts. So it's the different levels of resilience, capacity and capability around different countries. My dog, by the way, if you can hear that barking, different levels of capability have to be considered. There is no single approach that can be developed for resilience or improve vulnerability. It does vary, and I think that has to be taken into account, particularly when you're building policy level decisions around that type of strategy.
Thank you. Last question for both of you. How do you think, in addition to the government building resilience, how can we best do that as societies? And I'm talking now about liberal democracies because it's a completely different setup, obviously, in other countries. But how can we best do that? What, for example, from a corporate perspective, is necessary, do you think, Caroline, in order for well, both for operations to continue relatively unaffected and also for losses to be as limited as possible, and again based on whatever predictions are possible?
Yeah, I mean, so part of this has got to be the point that Gareth raised, which is just making sure that people don't just factor these issues out because they're too expensive to deal with. You know, that people genuinely look at the models and say, this is a realistic scenario and we need to have some kind of planning around it. I think insurance does play a role, but clearly isn't a complete solution. Obviously insurers are running their own business. They're not supposed to be some kind of global mutualized disaster recovery fund. And so, obviously they've got their own risks to manage. I think if you look at the context of the current disruption, governments have paid out something like $5 trillion to support their local economies. And that's actually more than the market capitalization of all listed global insurers. So that's just not really a possibility. It's not a complete solution, at least. At a very individual level, clearly people can put contractual mitigants into their contracts. You can have triggers for events of default, for force majeure clauses to make sure that they cover identified risks. And then looking at the personal investment side and the pension funds, the more information that people have and the more ability that they have to make informed choices around their investment decisions, the more ability they're going to have to protect themselves against those risks. So particularly in the EU, we're starting to see more regulation around investment disclosures. So requiring companies to publish information on their climate-related risks and the steps that they're taking to achieve Paris-aligned goals. I suppose there are potential new business opportunities here. Just looking at the UK, we've seen the formation of a partnership between the UK government and the insurance industry to develop Flood Re, which aims to make available flood insurance at a cheaper price and just actually available at all to people who live in high risk flood areas who haven't been able to access that sort of insurance. And then I suppose also, on the business opportunity front, potentially businesses developing new businesses, which could help to support people's business continuity planning. And I think particularly in the context of the current disruption again, we've seen a massive increase in people's awareness of all the different video call platforms, Zoom being a key one. So obviously, people who hadn't heard of Zoom 6 months ago, now we're talking over Zoom and people are very familiar with it. And obviously we've seen a corresponding spike in not just Zoom's share price, but actually other unassociated companies also called Zoom have experienced a sort of a spike in price as well. So yeah, there are steps that can be taken at a corporate level, but they are probably quite isolated individual efforts. And maybe what we do need is something a little bit more overarching.
Thank you, Caroline. And I'll interrupt you there. And I was going to let Matt answer the same question, but here is Roland again, who's making the best possible use of Zoom. This is exactly how it should work. So Roland, I'll let you come in. And if you can ask your question in a minute or so, Matt has a chance to finish before the hour, that would be fantastic. And thank you again for using Zoom in the way that it should.
Thank you. Just my question then, Matt, is in governments seeking to provide funding to remediate and mitigate against environmental disasters, how far should that funding extend to remediation? Should it just be limited to the human impact, or should we also then extend the funding to the impact on the environment? And my point being that it's sometimes if you leave the impact on the environment unremediated, it then has a long-term effect on the economics of the local environment which has been damaged.
Again, from my experience at the bank, Roland, every investment project or funding project or lending project that the World Bank operates has to consider environmental aspects to that project. It has to make sure that it's following strict rules around how. I mean, obviously, for instance, there could easily be issues around human development, increasing resilience, for instance, of infrastructure for power, having environmental degradation issues. So you've got to be really careful that you don't inadvertently or otherwise cause longer term impacts on the environmental well-being of a country or a region as part of the aims of a different strategy. And I think it's absolutely critical that those are hand in glove, basically. We're starting to see, for instance, biodiversity under COP26 become much more important. And I think that's definitely the way forward. It has to be part of the scenario set that you consider everything as much as you can.
Thank you, Matt. Very concise, which allows us to finish on the dot. So thank you very much, Matt and Caroline. And I think I feel a bit more upbeat despite the quite urgent nature of the subject and quite alarming nature of the subject. So thank you both very much, and thank you to Clifford Chance for organizing this event with us, and thank you also to Willis Towers Watson, Zurich Insurance, Fraser Nash Consultancy, the Ministry of Defense of Latvia, the Ministry of Defense of Lithuania, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, who have all supported modern deterrence. And thank you all for joining in and for discussing and for listening. And that's it. Have a good rest of the afternoon, and let's hope we don't. Let's hope these predictions are not in too negative, but they don't head in too negative a direction. So have a good afternoon.